Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Education All Things Matter. This week in Canada, we celebrated, and if you would call the word celebrated, I would say observed is a better word, the National Day of Reconciliation. And this involves our relationship with First Nations people here in Canada. A little sobering statistic. I want to cover today a little bit of discussion about an alternative to Western colonization that existed within the First Nations of the United States, the Hopi Indians. I would just call them the Hopi. We get into a couple of issues right away if you're non-Indigenous and you're speaking about Indigenous issues. One of these is trying to stay away from using the wrong languaging. And it's changed over the years, but in Canada, the preference is to use the term First Nations. Around the world, in the WHO, we use the word Indigenous for any population that had a long history with the land and were the original inhabitants and have a dominant civilization. And I think we should define civilization by Toynbee's newer discussion of the word. In the old days, a civilization might have been Rome, or might have been Brussels, or might have been the Yellow River civilization of India or Indo-Tibetan civilizations. But civilizations do not have to extend over tens of thousands of hectares or miles. A civilization can be a consistent set of values, practices, skills, technologies, language, metaphysics, psychology. These are all embedded in a civilization. So we would talk about Aztec civilization, and we can talk about Hopi civilization, or we might talk about Sioux civilization, and then we might even talk about Cree civilization. So respecting that all of these different tribes and all of these different origins were often just tens of thousands of miles from each other and really had no interaction. These were distinct civilizations with certain traits in common. So let's move ahead. And why I'm relating this to education is that I believe that if we study the teachings of the Hopi, we will understand more about how to do education properly. That there's a metaphysics that lie under education. And I talk about this in all my videos, the idea of a metanoic design for not only education, but building serious educational games. So let's just have a look here at some of the ideas that we might want to think about. So the Hopi live on a 1.5 million acre reservation in Arizona. And they have been stationary for the longest amount of time we know amongst the various hunting, gathering, and mobile tribes. They migrated north from Central America in about 500 BC. To give it perspective, in 500 BC, the Vikings had not been established. It was a quiet agrarian society in Scandinavia. In 500 BC, we were midway through the half-start of Carthage, the Carthaginian Empire, the first great trading empire that would go on. Rome was just finding its feet, and we had the Greek philosophers such as Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle speaking. So to give you an idea where the Hopi sit with respect to emerging civilizations around the world. So they were hunting and gathering, and they would live in pit houses, but about 700 AD, which would correspond to about the time the fall of the Roman Empire, the rise of the Christian Byzantine Empire. It was actually a couple hundred years earlier, but we would say about the same time in the Europe that empire was developing, the Hopi became agriculture and established themselves as an agricultural empire. So they started to build very large villages in these mesas that are in Arizona. And if you've ever seen these mesas, they're hoodoos and mesas are absolutely spectacular land formations. There's kind of a haunting spirituality about the land. And these were the kind of buildings they constructed using stone. They would sometimes build right into the side of a cliff, but it was using very stone. And this is obviously very good advanced technology for ventilation, for cooking, for preservation of food in the Arizona desert, which is not an easy place to inhabit. So when you get to 900 to 11 AD, now this is about the time that the first universities are opening, the first medical school, the University of Paris, the University of Berlin, who else? Salerno, this University of Salerno Medical School. So to just put it in perspective, now in this time in the Mesopotamian civilization, this is when Avicenna, the great Persian, expert in medicine, mathematics, and philosophy, and then Maimonides, which is the Hebrew counterpart. And this was also the time the Magna Carta and other things were written. So 911 AD is a significant time throughout all civilizations. So in the Hopi, they're developing these masonry villages, and then they develop larger villages, and you can see some of the names here on the screen. And then they develop the Kachina cult, and that is the idea that you have masking and dancing to celebrate a very metaphysical realm. And that's why we're interested in the topic today as it relates to our quest of education. So the Kachinas are, they're like the kami of Shinto in Japan. They're various deities and natural elements of animals. So this was a society which is not, it suggests pantheism, but this kind of animism, totemism, and fetishism, these are related shamanic practices. The idea is that you study each of these animals, these kachina, or these spirits that accompany the animals, and then you pass on these small figures, and they become kind of a keepsake of that transformative experience. And by the time you get to the 15th century, these are then part of the culture of the Pueblo tribes. And the Spanish begin to get aware of them because this is when colonization is just starting right here. Just to give you an idea what's going on to indigenous people in general at this time, there were 100 million in the combined Americas, estimated population size. And by the time colonization had advanced into the 17th century, a couple hundred years up to this point, there were only 1 million remaining. And this is across both Americas. So there was a massive destruction of the culture going on. So the Hopi were not immune to this. Massive droughts begin to destroy many of the villages. And you could imagine a drought in Arizona. And then they rebuild. And by the get to the 16th century, you get a highly developed ceremonial cycle and advanced agricultural systems and trade networks. So essentially, they developed their own version of Carthage. So this was a peaceful trading empire that barely picked up a weapon at any time. It was a matrilineal society, as many were. This harkens back to the Mesopotamian society. Now, to put it in perspective for the development of things in the world, this is the period of inquiry or the Enlightenment in Europe. So, as you can imagine, when Christians began to encounter them, and there's very little of a point, they're preserving their culture, but when they're in touch with the Spanish, they then brought their idea of Western civilization and tried to impose it on the Hopi. And there was very difficult times as the Spanish discovered that there was gold in them there. They wanted precious metals. They wanted to start to mine the area. And as we know, the Spanish conquistadors were absolutely horrifying to the existing South American cultures. Where some battles were recorded with as few as 100 cannons taking out tens of thousands of warriors with the advanced technology. So then the Catholic priests come in 1592 and they set up a missionary and they try to convert them all to Catholicism. Now, the Hopi acquire horses and different animals that they can use, of course, husbandry, and they also pick up smallpox, and smallpox spreads throughout Arizona, throughout the mesas. And the Hopi, of course, are also starting to inhabit New Mexico at this point. And these are devastating epidemics. Now, eventually, if we follow this follows the trajectory of indigenous peoples. They had to battle for survival eventually because these Europeans began to raid their villages. And then the Navajo began to press. So the Navajo were starting to enter their territory. So now they had to fight for survival. And then eventually Spain recognizes Mexico, and the Hopi lands are given to the Mexican government. And the Navajo continued to attack the Hopi at this time. So there's a kind of tragic story to downturn of it. But what's important about the Hopi is they believe that there were 5 different sort of ages of mankind. Now, this is exactly equivalent to the Greek idea of the different age, the golden and the silver and the bronze age, in which we kind of screwed it up a bunch of times. We've had a chance as humans to make it on this planet, and we kind of got wiped out, and then we were reborn, and then something else got us, and then nothing else got us. And depending where you sit with these cyclical natures of time and the evolution of the universe, you'll see these motifs. of different ages being, the age of Aquarius, of course, was made into the movie Hair in the 1960s. I remember in the 60s, they talked about the age of Aquarius, a time of peace based on astrology. So how does this relate to education? In the Hopi culture, they were not invaded, messed with, or asked to participate in warfare for most of their existence. And again, these things go back, as we've talked about 11,000 years or better, because we time everything from the crossing of the Bering Strait. There is some new evidence of some footprints picked up from time before that, 25,000 years ago, of a woman carrying a child. Child's footprints, women's footprints, and then the child footprints disappearing for a while, then reappearing, suggesting he was carrying the child. And those were found in Central America within the past couple of years. So it may turn out the Bering Strait hypothesis falls out, but the idea is that everyone came through the Bering Strait from Russia, etc., and made their way down through the Americas and settled. And all the domestic animals that we talk about were discovered long before that, most of in the Mesopotamian region of the developing Persian and Arab empires. So when we see what happens without colonization to a society like the Hopi, who don't have a lot of outside enemies, you see a peaceful nation develop. And so we want to remember this in this reconciliation time, the impact that we probably had by Eurocentric thinking on introducing war and disease and greed and currencies to a civilization, which was a true civilization. And we might want to teach ourselves and others how to return to that form. I would conclude by saying that according to Dimitri Papadopoulos, a professor of architecture at Toronto Metropolitan University, there is a choice that European civilizations made, which were not made by many of the indigenous civilizations, and that is to expand. Rome was an expansive empire. And there's another, and now many of our cities are based on that. But if we look at Barcelona and we look at some other examples that we've got historically as well, it's possible to develop a city that's small, that has a very small population, that has everything that's self-sufficient unto himself. And then there may be many adjacent cities or cells, and those adjacent cells that can participate in trade. Now, each one of these little cities, these honeycomb cities you might find in modern day Barcelona, has its own walkways, its own shopping, its own health care, it's got places to grow vegetables. So in other words, you have a community, a neighborhood. So if we look at it, had colonizing not occurred, and had war not occurred, which is a separate question, but colonization hastened the destruction, and it actually destroyed the Hopi Empire by the end. So we have examples of incredibly peaceful civilizations, and what we want to learn is how do we try to build those, and how do we, in everything we do in education, try to bring some of these indigenous ideas into our learning and try to embrace them with respectful permission. David Chandra's finishing off in the video for the week of National Reconciliation, which is a national holiday here in Canada. I spoke on the Indigenous history of First Nations on Monday, but I don't feel qualified to do so in this public medium without having an elder with me. Thank you very much. We'll see you for the next video.